And good evening, everyone. We'll just give people a couple of minutes to enter the room, and then we'll get started with our talking tours session with Clive Paget this evening.
It's a good morning from me.
It is over in London.
Actually, I can even see the sun breaking through here. There's a surprise.
Well, it's just gone down here, and it's been very nice for us to actually see the sun. You haven't seen much of it in Sydney for the past few weeks. In the spirit of reconciliation, Limelight Arts Travel acknowledges the traditional custodians of country and their connections to land, sea, and community. And we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Well, in this evening's session of Talking Tours, we have Clive Paget, who's coming to us live from London to talk about Mozart and his relationship to Salzburg ahead of the tour we have running to Mozart and the Mozart week in Salzburg, followed by a stay in Vienna. So Clive is the editor-at-large of Limelight magazine, and before that he's had a very long and interesting career involved with all sorts of aspects of classical music and theatre. So it's a delight to have him on our Talking Tour session tonight to talk more about Mozart and his connections to Salzburg. So welcome, Clive.
Hi.
Great. As maybe a starting point, Clive, how did your career in music begin?
Well, I suspect, like everybody else, I was keen on music as a kid. I played the E-flat tenor horn at school, which I didn't enjoy particularly because it wasn't an orchestral instrument, and I was kind of interested in orchestral music at that point, and it didn't seem a terribly useful thing. It was a brass band instrument. Really, I sang a bit, and then when I went to university, I literally fell in love with opera through joining the University Operatic Society, and then I found myself burrowing through the music library at university, looking for obscure operas because I became really interested in the sort of byways of the repertoire and the inevitable question: why are these fabulous pieces never seen? I suppose that was my way in, and I then became an avid collector of music, while at the same time performing as an amateur singer and then later actor, while I was working as an aeronautical engineer.
Which is the bit that I'm sure fascinates and surprises everyone, that you're an aeronautical engineer while also having this burgeoning growth as more than an aficionado of classical music.
Well, I mean, some people would say, "Oh, Clive Paget can't stick at anything," but I did. Yeah, I think if I'd been given the choice earlier on or encouraged into it earlier on, I probably would have followed music and drama as a passion. I was just a sort of broad-based person, and in those days they wanted people who could do sciences, and I could do sciences, so I was sort of funneled into that as part of the 1970s, early 80s tech shortfall in the UK. So that was kind of how I got there. But I mean, I almost immediately in my 20s, I started to realize that I started to kind of work on the sort of basis where I could occasionally get paid for singing, and I realized that some of the people I was working with in amateur operatics and were professionals themselves or had been professionals, and I thought, well, if they can do it, why can't I? And so by the age of 30, I decided to become a professional, both first of all a professional singer and actor, then a director of musical theatre. Really, because that's where my voice tended to lead me. I wasn't ever quite good enough to sing opera or big enough voiced to sing opera. Went into the kind of Sondheim end of music theatre, and then found my way to a brand new off West End venue, which I saw was part of the founding team at, where I worked for 10 years, and then went to the National Theatre in London to work as now Sir Nicholas Heitner, but in those days just Nick Heitner, as his music theatre consultant. So it was my job to bring people together who might. I organised a symposium, and I was very proud to say my initial symposium at the National Theatre included both Harrison Birtwistle, the real sort of hardcore classical music end, and Neil Hannon from the Pet Shop Boys. I brought them together in a symposium. I thought it was quite a coup.
Yeah, that is. I imagine it would have been an interesting symposium as well, as well with those.
Yes, I can't say they had the same idea of where music theatre should be going, but
No, no. So moving from kind of musical theatre and kind of that direction you took, you've then kind of moved into music journalism and music criticism, and more recently into leading tours where you get to kind of have groups of people where you can talk to about the music and give them background about the music, as well as I suppose, the cultural context of what was happening in that particular moment. Is there one thing you enjoy most about being with a small group of people overseas, listening to performances by some of the finest ensembles in Europe, for example?
well, that you've sort of described the sheer pleasure of that kind of work that we do. Look, I think for me, I mean, and this is something I discovered. I was always interested in shared enthusiasm for stuff. As someone who was pushing obscure operas on opera companies, and why don't we perform this? Through to when I moved to Australia, I worked for a few years in classical music retail, dealing with the general public. And some people said, "What on earth are you doing that for?" And I said, "Well, it's actually really enjoyable to meet people every day who share your enthusiasms, and you discuss this and you share that and all this kind of stuff." So when Robert Veal asked me if I'd like to do cultural tour leading, I thought, well, yes. I mean, and actually on my cultural tours, I've met a few people who I first met in working for Fish Fine Music in Sydney. I mean, it was there's a shared history of some of these people, and still for me, it's about those leading tours. It's about spending time with people who enjoy what you enjoy, really. And I learn as much from the people on my tours as they learn from me, I'm sure.
It is that wonderful thing as well. There is that kind of that back and forth, and kind of people know all, as you discover, people know all sorts of things about all sorts of things that you had no idea were even knowable. Yes, and as well as different interpretations of music, which is always fun to discuss. So when it came to putting together a tour based in Salzburg for the Mozart Week, which takes place celebrating Mozart's birthday each year in January, is there something that kind of appealed to you about a tour that focuses on a celebration of Mozart?
I think first of all, it's interesting because I always talk to people on the tours that I go on, and you talk to them about the kind of thing they're interested in, and you do realize Mozart is one of those. Everyone loves Mozart. There's even people who would consider themselves to be hardcore late 20th century classical music people. They still like Mozart. There's something about Mozart which is universally appealing, partially the sheer talent and invention of the man, but his music is approachable. It's sufficiently complex to make revisiting it like an endless journey of discovery. So that was immediately. I thought, we should do a Mozart tour, and the Salzburg Mozart Festival is probably the most impressive Mozart festival that there is annually, and of course it's based in the city in which he was born and spent probably the majority of his working life. I mean, what I thought was really interesting to do would be to then go to Vienna, because of course Mozart's move to Vienna was probably the most important thing from a career perspective that he did, and actually was hugely influential, not just in the way it affected Mozart's life, but in the way other composers at that time had the choice of working for a patron or taking the enormous risk of becoming a freelancer. And Mozart was one of the first people to really take that chance and create a freelance career. And therefore, it seemed to me logical that we would add a Vienna leg onto the event.
So we can sort of follow in his footsteps there.
Yeah.
Just
Yes.
put up a couple of questions. Firstly, about how significant was Mozart's early life in Salzburg for the development of his later career? Is he, or was he somewhat of an outsider who was able to almost reshape the world in his later image?
I think the interesting thing about Mozart, unlike Beethoven, who was someone who reshaped the world in his own image, Mozart was a quiet achiever in that sense. I mean, I don't mean quiet I mean, he was an enormous hit as a 8-year-old kid being taken, 6-year-old kid even being taken around Europe and paraded in front of the great and the good in exchange for money or jewelry or whatever. After Mozart and his sister had performed this or whatever kind of thing, they were often given rings or literally bags of money. Here you are. That was very nice, thank you, kind of thing. But Mozart, although he was a phenomenon in that sense, his music was conformed to the kind of music that was around at the time. So you hear, for example, I mean, one of the biggest influences on Mozart was Johann Christian Bach, who was Bach's youngest son from his second marriage, and J.C. Bach, as he's known, went to London, where he became known as John Brooke, being the straightforward translation of Johann Bach, where he became enormously successful both as a composer and as an impresario. And when Mozart wound up at the age of 8 in London, he and Johann Christian Bach formed there was an immediate bond there. And you can hear that in Mozart's First Symphony, which was written in 1764, when Mozart was 8, was written in London and very much under the influence of J.C. Bach. And there are stories of the boy Mozart sitting on J.C. Bach's knee at the harpsichord and things like that. Yeah, it was that kind of adult-child relationship that was so important to him. What I think is really interesting about Mozart is that although he does, on the whole, conform to the style of music that's around, and you can hear the influences of the early symphonists from the Mannheim school, that he visited Mannheim, where he heard the greatest court orchestra that were beginning to, under Stamitz, were creating symphony as we know it, a 4-movement work like that. You can hear him taking those influences on board. But I think what's really interesting about Mozart is the way he's a sort of quiet revolutionary. He does things which are unexpected, but they're not, he doesn't do anything like stick a great choral finale on the end of a symphony like Beethoven, or dedicate a work to Napoleon or something like that. But he does it through small things. And part of that, I think, is this extraordinary power of invention that he has. He's able to sort of, he never does work which you would consider to be, work a day. And what I think is really interesting about Mozart is the number of fragments that exist. I mean, that you can fill 5 discs with Mozart fragments, and you can see what you can see Mozart doing is kind of going, this is going nowhere. This doesn't feel very original. I'll give up on that and I'll do something else, which is why the music that we do have always feels so fresh. It's like if he was clearly able to recognize something that felt a bit stale and like yesterday's composition, and was quite happy to move on and just park that. And we're lucky to have all those fragments, because it's a terribly interesting thing. You listen to them and you kind of go, "Oh, that's really rather. I wonder why he didn't finish that." But when you really think about it, you can kind of you can sort of see it feels a bit like something he's done before, or that kind of thing.
And is that sort of uh, dislike of a lack of inventiveness what he might have found stultifying with his time in Salzburg when he was working for the Prince Archbishop?
Well, I mean, he had two problems working. One. So Mozart spent a huge amount of time touring Europe as a young celebrity. But when he eventually returned to Salzburg after that, he did get effectively a position as a court musician to Hieronymus Colloredo, who was the rather grand Prince Archbishop, and actually went on. Well, I mean, he was Prince Archbishop until 1802, I think, or something like that, before they abolished the whole Prince Archbishopric, and he went into exile, I think, at that point. But Colloredo was one of those people. He wanted the prestige of having Mozart in his orchestra, but he wasn't prepared, or composing music for his players or whatever, but he wasn't prepared to pay him very much money. And that was a big problem for Mozart, who wanted to live a decent lifestyle. And he had been used to getting quite lucrative commissions. When he was traveling around Europe, I mean, when he went to Milan or Rome or whatever, and people said, "Oh, we'd love an opera for you," they gave him quite a large amount of money for doing that, and he wasn't getting that in Salzburg. Not only that, the Prince Archbishop's tastes were, on the whole, conservative. He didn't really want new stuff or innovation. He was interested in things like church music, obviously, and a lot of Mozart's church music comes from the Salzburg period. I mean, interestingly, the five violin concertos all come from the Salzburg period. And I don't think that any of them were written specifically with the Prince Archbishop in mind. But it was Mozart's real passion was opera. That's what he wanted to do. And the Prince Archbishop had no interest in that whatsoever. And he didn't necessarily want opera. He probably actually frowned on opera as a frivolous art form or whatever. So Mozart felt a little bit stuck in that respect. I mean, it was his home and his family were there, his sister and his father was so influential to him. But Mozart did want to try and get out of that, and eventually he resigned. In fact, he resigned twice from Salzburg. The first time he resigned and then went off for 2 years trying to find someone who would give him a better post. Only to return to Salzburg and be given a more sort of a better sounding title, but not a great deal more money. And the second time he resigned, he was literally he was insulted to the extent of having the Prince Archbishop's steward sent him packing with a kick up the arse, I think is the phrase that was used. And that was Mozart's goodbye to Salzburg.
Well, we won't be promising people to kick up the asses as they go on their way to Vienna after being in Mozart Week. Just picking up on what you were saying about his love of opera and how his love of opera was a great kind of motivator for him. One of the performances that's a highlight of the coming Mozart Week in Salzburg is a new production of The Magic Flute. And it's to ask kind of where the Magic Flute fits in that kind of a broader trajectory of his operas.
So there are a couple of interesting things here. One is when Mozart was very young, he was commissioned to write. On the whole, he was writing what's known as opera seria, which is operas on classical themes, ancient historical themes, Roman history or myth or whatever kind of thing. And he started doing that incredibly young. He was 14 when he had his first commission to write Mitridate, and going in as a 14-year-old boy with the grandest singers around. In Mitridate, there were three castrati, and the castrati were famously prima donnas, prima uomini. You didn't, and Mozart didn't have a lot of time for that, but he had to make it work because he had very little status compared with them. And those were the days when every major singer had arias in their back pocket, which became known as trunk arias, that they carried around. And if the composer of a new piece didn't write something they thought was sufficiently impressive, they would whip out this thing and say, "No, I think I sing this, which is a great aria, which show off my coloratura," I don't know, whatever kind of thing. So the miracle with Mozart is that he managed to avoid that almost completely. So you could see immediately that these very grand singers immediately realized that what he was writing for them was absolutely what they wanted to sing. And many singers popped Mozart arias into their trunks to take round for other people's performances. So you find, and indeed some singers would actually come to Mozart and say, "Oh, I've got a real bummer of an aria in Miss Slivovich's opera, blah, blah, blah. Could you write me something better?" And I'll then rock up and say, "Here, I've got a Mozart aria for you." So that you get a real sense of him sort of developing his craft through that Italian format. And the Italian opera, for him, probably for the first 10, 15 years of his life, that Italian opera was the format. And if you know the format, that da capo aria format, where you get a lovely tuneful first section, you then get a very contrasting second section. So if the first section's happy, the second section will be "but on the other hand, I could be sad," and then you'd get a repeat of the first section, and the repeat is where the singer was meant to decorate the aria and show off their vocal skills. So Mozart became very gifted in writing those kind of da capo arias, which went down a bomb. His tours around that kind of Italian opera was popular in London. It was popular in Italy, of course. It was even popular in Germany. Occasionally, you find these bizarre sort of things where a composer like Reinhard Kaiser, for example, would write an opera with arias in Italian but recitatives in German. They respected the Italian aria form, but they realized that their audience couldn't follow the recitative in Italian, so they'd switch languages partway through. And sometimes you find them doing other things, which is that the romantic characters sing arias in Italian, but the comic characters, who are often servants, sing arias in German, because the ordinary people will find that funny. They wouldn't find it funny if it was sung in Italian, because they wouldn't quite understand it, kind of thing. So you get this extraordinary sort of mix that's going on at the time. And Mozart, by the time he arrived in Vienna, Joseph II, who was the Habsburg, relatively newly installed Habsburg emperor, had a real passion for what was known as the German Singspiel, which is a sort of spoken sung amalgamation where the spoken text goes between the arias. And Joseph was very keen that this art form would develop in his court and rival Italian opera. These sort of nationalistic things went on in all sorts of countries. If you think back to the previous generation with Handel in London, there were avid Italian opera fans, but there were a lot of people who wanted, like Purcell, who started to write English opera before he died way too young, and then Italian opera took over. So there was always these sort of tensions between opera in the local language and Italian opera, which was seen by connoisseurs as the thing to be into. And so Mozart, when he went to Vienna, first of all as a freelancer, one of the first things he did was write Die Entführung aus dem Serail, or The Escape from the Seraglio, which is a comedy, and it's a Singspiel with text and whatever. It also tapped into what was a very popular form at the time, which is this idea of Janissary music. So the Austrians, who'd been endlessly attacked by the Turks for many, many years, they were very aware of this sort of military Turkish music with cymbals and bells and all this kind of stuff. And Die Entführung starts off with this fabulous overture, which opens with a crash of cymbals and a jingle of bells and all this kind of stuff. So Mozart was very aware of what was popular, and he wrote this very much to the popular taste. Joseph, unfortunately for Mozart, who never really gave Mozart a major court role, was also quite conservative. I think he famously uttered the words "too many notes, Mozart." It was like kind of it was yes, it's very nice, but it's yeah, it could be simpler, because Mozart was a sophisticated musician, and so. What's interesting is that Die Entführung, which is probably predates the Marriage of Figaro by 8 or 9, the Magic Flute by 8 or 9 years. Between that, he didn't really write in that style again. So from Seraglio onwards, he goes back to Italian opera, but then he starts to develop Italian opera in a really interesting way, particularly through the great operas he wrote with Da Ponte, 1786, The Marriage of Figaro, 78, the Don Giovanni, and then 79, Cosi fan tutti. And what's extraordinary about those is it is by working with a really interesting librettist, Mozart is able to really explore the freedom of the medium in ways which other people were not able to do, which is really interesting. I think when you listen, even though Cosi fan tutti was probably the least successful of Mozart's operas, because people I think didn't really fully appreciate the storyline, the work that came after it. There are only really after that there's only La Clemenza di Tito, which he was writing at the same time as the Magic Flute, and La Clemenza di Tito feels very old-fashioned compared with the Da Ponte operas. And indeed, La Clemenza di Tito is set to a libretto by Pietro Metastasio, who was an 18th century poet and librettist. So it's a really old libretto that Mozart's setting. I mean, Gluck had set it, and in fact, even earlier composers had set that libretto. So when he comes to do the Magic Flute, it's really interesting, because what you see him doing is you see him taking all that experience he's had working with Da Ponte on these operas, which are really sort of expanding the art form, and putting that into a German Singspiel. And what's really interesting about Die Entführung was very much written for the emperor, but the Magic Flute was an utterly commercial venture. So Emanuel Schikaneder, who was the great impresario of the day, and who had a theatre just outside of Vienna, and I think that was specifically to avoid it falling under intrusive rules that were applied to people who were working in the city. But Schikaneder was a great entrepreneur and knew what it was that people wanted, and he knew that what the people wanted was Mozart. And he knew that he could sell far more tickets to a broader audience if he did a German Singspiel. He would pack them in, and indeed he did. It was an enormous success. Mozart conducted the premiere and went back to see it on numerous occasions, taking people to see. Taking his friends and colleagues to see it. He was very proud of it. I mean, I've no idea what it would have been like if you were there. I mean, Schikaneder himself played the Papageno role, and I'm sure was a master of comic shtick. Probably had them rolling in the aisles, but those kind of Singspiels tended on before that to be relatively straightforward. Mozart is putting arias like the Queen of the Night's arias. They're not arias that any old singer can come along and bash out. I mean, he was demanding an absolutely first-rate cast to go into an art form which was generally seen as something a bit more like vaudeville or something like that. So it
is fascinating. Just to comment on the kind of where we started this conversation about musical theatre, and that there's perhaps a popular aspect of Mozart's work that is become a little bit more obscure, at least to those who are less familiar with classical music. That kind of, while he is the bee's knees, or is the most successful, most popular composer ever, forgetting that there was a genuinely popular amongst more than just the aristocracy at the time.
Yeah, I mean, Marriage of Figaro was hugely popular everywhere. I mean, it was even, and of course remains so. I mean, it's a work of absolute genius in every respect. And Don Giovanni also was so popular when it premiered in Prague that it almost immediately transferred to Vienna in a slightly different version. And it was he was Mozart. I mean, and the other thing I think we forget. So Mozart died at the age of 35. There is no I mean, even if you consider to be something like I mean, I would still describe something like Figaro, which he wrote when he was 29 or whatever, as early Mozart. I mean, had he lived to be 70, like someone or nearly, yeah, had he lived as long as Beethoven, well, I mean, apart from anything else, he would have been composing at the same time as Beethoven. We'd have seen Beethoven and Mozart works alongside each other, and how does one impact the other? Yeah, where was he going? It's extraordinary to think if you look at that last year in Mozart's life, every single work you feel is stretching himself that little bit further. The Jupiter Symphony, his longest symphony, the Magic Flute, his most popular and immediately entertaining. He clearly wasn't the Clarinet Concerto, his most popular concerto. Yeah, all come from that last year. So you think, well, there's no sign of his powers of invention drying up. Where would he have gone, and how might he be inspired to develop had he heard Beethoven's Eroica Symphony? Yeah, what impact might that have had on Mozart? I mean, they were living in the same city. It's
Yeah. It's a fascinating thing to think about kind of a very interesting counterfactual that I'm sure that there could be many evenings spent arguing about the possibilities of what wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, the irony is that Beethoven went to Vienna specifically with the intention of studying with Mozart, but we don't know whether he did. We have no idea whether they even met. And so, I mean, we know both Beethoven and Mozart met Haydn, and we know that Beethoven spent some time with Haydn. That didn't go particularly well for Beethoven, who I think was always off there looking in that direction. But Haydn and Mozart, who met when Haydn was, I would say, late middle age, they got on enormously well, and they dedicated string quartets to each other. They played in the same ad hoc string quartet. I mean, can you imagine being a fly on the wall, whether someone kind of goes, "Oh, there's a string quartet evening, whatever." Haydn's on violin, Mozart on viola. It's just kind of extraordinary to think of these people that you might have happened to bump into in those days.
Yes. And just thinking a little bit more now about the program. Remember, one of the things you mentioned about the program of Mozart Week is that they're able to kind of select works that span Mozart's whole career, as brief as it was, despite the sheer size of his creation. Are there any particular works that you think highlight different aspects of his career? Is there kind of, I suppose, a rhyme and reason behind the festival, or are they more just focusing on, well, we didn't do this one last year?
Well, when I looked at what we're going to see, I think what I think is fabulous about it is it does span the whole career, but it does so we get the First Symphony, for example, and we get the 41st, the Jupiter Symphony. So we can see, I mean, and even if you think about that, the First Symphony written when he was 8 and the Jupiter written when he was 35, that's it's not a huge amount of time has gone by between them, but the difference between those two works is extraordinary. So you get an immediate sense of the sheer breadth of music that he was writing over that career. But I think what's interesting, and I don't know whether they particularly planned this, but I think it's an interesting thing for us. There is a focus on that last year, which is such an extraordinary year for Mozart. If you know anything about Mozart, what most people tend to think about Mozart is that he died poor. But what's interesting when you look at the career is that actually, on the whole, for a long time, he wasn't badly off. There were periods when the income dropped, and one of those periods was just before that final year. And most people now think that actually in that final year, things were looking up for him financially, and the work that he produced, the from both Clemenza di Tito and the Magic Flute, the Clarinet Concerto, the Jupiter Symphony. These were all major pieces. And the fact that he was buried in what people used to call a pauper's grave, which is a misnomer. He was just simply buried in an unmarked grave, which is where you put non-noble people. Joseph had this weird burial policy, which said, and also said that if you were ordinary, you went into that hole in that place, and in 10 years you'd be dug up and thrown away. And that was the difference. Nobles got to remain where they were buried. Ordinary folk had 10 years, and then they were moved on. And so that's why no one knows where Mozart is buried. But it's not because he was necessarily extraordinarily hard up at that point. And there are indications that his income was on the rise again by that stage. But certainly the level of invention that was there. And also the drive. I mean, when you look at what the energy and what he was committing himself to. I mean, you could argue that one of the things that almost certainly exacerbated his early demise was simply working himself too hard. I mean, he was burning midnight oil left, right, and centre, and producing these extraordinary things, many of which he was directly involved in the production of both of those two operas. He was intimately involved in the actual creation, but also the initial performances. So, but that was something that I thought was particularly. I mean, other than that, the fact that you get this span and this focus on the last year, the other pieces that they've sort of picked out on that, I would describe as among the great works from different parts of the career. So we get the third violin concerto, which is I think one of my favorite of the five. And we get the 21st piano concerto, which is the one that everyone still calls the second movement, the Elvira Madigan slow movement. But I mean, we get some of those real blockbuster pieces, and we get them performed by people of such extraordinary talent.
Yeah,
that
I was about to ask. That you mentioned early on that Mozart had always had an excellent relationship with the actual singers. I was just wondering in the back of my mind, is there still an appeal for performers today to perform at somewhere like Salzburg?
I'm sure there is. I mean, when you look at who is performing there, for example, so to start off with, you've got the Vienna Phil, right? So no mean no mean band, and so attracting conductors and soloists who will perform in Salzburg with the Vienna Phil is not necessarily a difficult thing. But I have to say, looking on paper, I mean, we have an extraordinary lineup of performers, and yes, I'm sure they're all delighted to perform in Salzburg, but I suspect also they're delighted to be performing with conductors of the sort of level that we're getting to hear, and with an orchestra as effortlessly aristocratic as the Vienna Philharmonic.
Yes. So among the performers who will be there in January, are there any in particular that you're looking forward to hearing?
Well, I mean, what I loved about looking through the program is you look at something and you think, oh, the third violin concerto. Well, many people can play that, and then you look on the thing and you kind of go, oh, it's Daniel Hope. That's someone. So you don't see Daniel Hope that often because he's so in demand, and yet he's more than happy to do the third violin concerto in Salzburg with Vienna Phil, and similarly Igor Levit. playing the piano concerto. I mean, Levitt is one of those pianists who I could hear play anything. And to be honest, his reputation tends to be in the big showcase pieces, 20th century, things that people kind of go, you're brave to tackle that. It's huge kind of thing. And I'll be fascinated to hear his Mozart, because I've heard, for example, I mean, his late Brahms is beautiful and poetic, and not at all like, for example, I mean, the pieces he became famous very early on for playing are sort of the 1 hour, like the Rzuski, the People United Will Never Be Defeated, which is some huge sort of thing, variations on a protest song kind of thing with a million hands. But he's a very eloquent performer, and I think hearing his Mozart, and it's also that's been conducted by Adam Fischer, who's probably one of the greatest Mozart conductors. There are only, I think, still I'm going to say 3 conductors who've conducted the full cycle of Haydn symphonies, for example, who have that sort of breadth of knowledge of the classical repertoire. And Adam Fischer is one of those. And he is a great Mozartian. So yeah, there are people like that in there. I mean, in terms of the singers, we have Magdalena Kozena, for example, who's someone I would go to hear sing anything. Oddly enough, in this, she's singing in a concert. It's the one thing, I think it's the only thing that comes out of the classical period, which is Berlioz's Les Nuits d'été song cycle. And I think the reason to put that in there is because of all the 19th century romantics, Berlioz was probably the one with his feet most firmly in the classical period, for all his crazy, enormous orchestras and whatever. You sensed that Berlioz, his passions were Gluck, Mozart, and so I think there's that sense that we're looking at that. I mean, there's also for interest. I mean, we hear a Haydn symphony, for example, in one of the concerts while we're there. One of the symphonies that Haydn wrote during Mozart's lifetime. So yeah, and so sort of getting the sense of that relationship between the two of them. We also hear a work by Gluck. Gluck's operas were enormously influential on Mozart. Very different. But Gluck had a very close relationship in Vienna with Salieri, who of course was Mozart's great rival, although they were on friendly terms, unlike the impression you're given in Amadeus. But Gluck and Salieri were going in one direction, and Mozart was not, in terms of the way he looked at opera. And also there's one concert which contrasts Mozart with Joseph de Boulogne, the Chevalier de Saint Georges, who was this extraordinary, he was from the Caribbean. He was an extraordinary black composer and violinist and swordsman, famously, who Mozart met in Paris on a number of occasions. Saint Georges was based in Paris, and Saint Georges is sometimes referred to as the Black Mozart. I think that's a little bit not doing Saint Georges down, but actually he's his own independent. I don't feel Saint Georges is in any way copying Mozart, and nor do I feel that Mozart is copying Saint Georges. But their music is very much in the same territory and coming out of the same sort of melting pot of musical influences.
Well, it's a really interesting selection, and being able to trace some of what is going on between across those connections and between them while in Salzburg is something that will be a great pleasure for you and for people there as well. Do those sort of, I suppose, reflections of Mozart's music continue when the tour heads to Vienna? Or are they?
Yes, they
just... Yep.
No, I would say La Traviata is probably the one that doesn't fit into any particular model, and that's the opera we finish with in a production by Simon Stone, Australian director, at the Vienna Staatsoper with a very strong cast, I think. A singer who I've heard here a couple of times now. I'm going to have to look at her name so that I pronounce it because it's got too many H's and K's in it. But her name is Christina Mkhitaryan.
Yeah,
Yes, it's got a rather awkward K and an H after the M and before the before the I. I'm not quite sure how you do that, but she sang Violetta in Glyndebourne 6 years ago and brought the house down. And has just done last year. She did Eugene and Onegin at the Royal Opera House. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing her sing that. But the other two operas, I think, are interestingly connected. I mean, Der Rosenkavalier, Richard Strauss, is Strauss's most Mozartian work. And it's, of course, traditionally it's set in the Mozartian period, and in theory it's in that sort of Habsburg Empire, the sort of frock coats and powdered wigs
out of weeks.
that,
Yes, yeah.
that Mozart was in. So strictly speaking, I mean, one never can tell with productions where they're going to put things at any given time. But in some respects, Der Rosenkavalier is the archetypal 20th century idea of Mozart opera, but filtered through Richard Strauss's late Romantic style of music. And the other one, which I think is really interesting, is Giulio Cesare, Julius Caesar, the Handel. Mozart was a huge fan of Handel. He discovered Handel in Vienna. He was introduced to the work of Handel by Van Swieten, who was the person who wrote the libretto for Haydn's Creation and the Seasons. And Van Swieten was one of these. He was a diplomat come music lover, sort of knew everybody and wrote librettos for all sorts of people. And he introduced Mozart to Handel's music. And as a result of that, Mozart reorchestrated to bring Handel up to date. He reorchestrated the Messiah, famously with clarinets in it, which had not been invented when Handel wrote that. And it's still performed, the Mozart arrangement of Handel's Messiah. But Mozart also arranged Alexander's Feast by Handel and Acis and Galatea. He became really obsessed with Handel, and actually, when people think about the Magic Flute, a lot of people kind of go the fugal duet for the two armed men in the second act is very influenced by Mozart's interest in Baroque music that kind of came later in his career, and the idea of finding a way of using those forms which were seen as ancient music at that point, and
Yeah.
bringing them forward. So the Julius Caesar, I think, is a fabulous way of a homage to one of Mozart's great musical gods in Handel. Plus, I have to say, it is the so I've seen Il Pomodoro do a lot of Handel recently. They've been doing it and recording it with the very finest singers. And this is obviously part of their Handel project. And I would be almost certain that they will be recording this and it will be out on disc in a couple of years' time. But we have Jakob Józef Orliński as Caesar in it, the Polish countertenor. Having just come back from Aix, where our festival opened, or the Limelight tour festival opened with Orliński's recital. He absolutely, I mean, he had us eating out of the palm of our hands from the start.
Yeah.
He's the most engaging and endearing performer with a fabulous voice, and I'm sure he'll be a brilliant. I saw him do a couple of years ago. I saw him do Didymus in Theodora at the Royal Opera House. He's a fabulous stage performer. And Sabine Devier, who's a high French singer. She's probably well, she was, I would have described her as the coloratura singer of her generation, but she's sort of broadened her repertoire to include contemporary music and stuff like that. But she's a phenomenal singer and a great actor, and she's singing Cleopatra. So I just feel, I mean, it's for those who like Handel opera, it should be musical heaven.
Which sounds like a fantastic place for us to end, given that what you've described to us and what we can expect in Salzburg and Vienna, but also I think very importantly the way how you're able to draw out the connections so succinctly between these various works. Yes, anyone would think you've had some practice at kind of helping people kind of get behind all the different angles of what might be going on within a piece of music as well as its performance history.
No, but I don't you? I mean, you're the same. The connections between everything is connected, and it's just the joy of discovering new connections. That is, you just kind of go, oh look, that's yes, I should have known. You know, that's half the joy of doing this.
It is. It is. I couldn't agree with you more, Clive. Well, thank you very, very much for sharing your morning with us in sunny London. Can see the sun shining. It looks a little brighter than last time we were talking. Yes. And if any questions come to mind later from the audience, if you'd like to send them through to us at our regular contact address, we can pass them on to Clive.
Cool. Happy to answer anything.
Excellent. Otherwise, thank you again, Clive, for being available. Absolutely. And thank you those who have come in to listen. And if there's something you missed during the session, this recording will come to you tomorrow via email.